Thank you very much for that introduction, and it really is a privilege and a pleasure to be here with you this morning and share a few moments thinking about our responsibility to God and man, especially as we are part of a major healthcare organization. I also want to say thank you for the music. Makes me wish that I had my flute with me and I would have played with you. Thank you very much. I enjoyed all of the music today. Some years ago, I was asked to teach the Bible as literature. That was an interesting assignment, especially for someone who is a preacher's daughter. But I began to see some parts of the Bible in an entirely different way. Besides it being our book of worship, think about the Psalms and some of the beautiful poetry that we have in the Psalms. But I think what captured my own imagination even better were some of the stories in the Bible. Some of the stories that are timeless and that cross borders, both of religion and geography. One of these stories is the story of Jonah, which some people think was simply a little illustration. But the story of Jonah actually happened in the New England days when people caught whales. And there was a 12-year-old boy who went out on one of those whaling ships with his father. He fell overboard. You can imagine how kids might be on a ship like that. And the whale literally did swallow him. It wasn't just a myth. Well, of course, in a panic, they caught the poor whale, cut him open, and out stepped the boy. And there were plenty of witnesses, but on top of that, his face was all mottled because of the stomach acid. So nobody could say you made up this story. Another story that really fascinated me, partly because of my own background, was the story of the Good Samaritan. This is a story that has captured people's imagination and hearts in every part of the world, the story of the Good Samaritan, no matter what the religion. And what I'd like to talk to you about briefly today is the power of one individual to make a difference. The story of the Good Samaritan, as you have just heard it read very nicely, is a unique one, but also it portrays once again the power that Jesus had in his ability to tell a good story. Sometimes we think stories have to be long, have to have a lot of details. The power of a good story to keep our attention and make a point certainly was illustrated by this one. First of all, the setting is important. If you watch some favorite program on TV, you notice one of the first things is, where does this take place? Sometimes it's mythical, sometimes it's in another country, in a city. In the United States, many of our programs are filmed either on the West Coast or New York City. The setting was certainly dramatic. Jesus' listeners knew that this road that you see in front of you here was a very dangerous one. First of all, when I started in Jerusalem and went down to Jericho, it was a severe drop. Something like 3,400 feet between, let's say, 20 miles. And it was a very dangerous one. Most people tried to travel in groups. But as happened in Jesus' story, and perhaps he intended it to make a point, the travelers had to go alone. This is what it looked like back then. Very inhospitable, very dangerous road. Well, Jesus picked some very interesting characters as well. The first one to come on the scene was the priest. You could equate him to some of the people in the very building that I work in. The priest, the leader of the people. And so Jesus' listeners thought, okay, this will be a very short story. Surely the priest will take care of this poor traveler who was beaten up by the robbers. He was traveling alone. He was robbed, and he was left for dead. To their surprise, the priest walks by. And he probably remembered that if he so much as touched a dead body, he would lose his turn of temple service, and that meant more to him than the suffering of one human being. Then came the Levite, and if you remember, the Levites were designated from the time that they were in the Exodus. They were supposed to serve the people. So again, Jesus' listeners thought, well, here's the end of the story. The Levite will surely take care of this traveler. So what's Jesus' point? The Levite probably went over, if we read the Bible correctly, and looked at the man and thought, well, what can I do? And then he remembered that he was making himself more vulnerable to those same robbers and murderers. So he hurried on. Well, then Jesus brought the hero, but it certainly surprised his audience, because the Jews and the Samaritans were lifelong enemies. They hated each other. So here Jesus is speaking to a group of Jews. A Jewish attorney had just asked him the question that began the whole story, and you can almost hear the music. Here comes the villain, the Samaritan. Imagine the surprise of Jesus' audience when this Samaritan turns out to be the hero. The Samaritan stopped. He knew what to do to alleviate the pain of this poor traveler. He put this traveler on his own beast of burden, which many depict as a donkey, which I like because when I was growing up in South America, I had a pet donkey and really appreciated that creature. He took a slower pace, and he took this man by himself with his resources to the inn. What kind of a person was this Samaritan? He certainly was ministering to someone who, under other circumstances, hated him. Probably, or maybe, wouldn't have done the same. He must have been kind. He must have been a generous individual. And one thing that I find interesting, his credit was good, because he said, here's some money, and if you need more, next time I'm here, I'll pay you the rest. Certainly an interesting individual. And this is the current view of that inn where he took this poor traveler, where the Good Samaritan took the man who had been beat up. And this is how it looks today. You can see that whole area is still very inhospitable. And yet the Good Samaritan comes down in history in so many depictions, as I have shown you here, various ways of depicting who was this Good Samaritan. And I think that maybe we like to see him in so many different versions because we like to think that this kind of kindness is universal. I was fortunate to experience the Good Samaritan myself. I was born in the little country I just showed you of Estonia. Estonia has always been a highly disputed country because of its location. Let me show that to you again. Surrounded by water, especially thousands of years ago when the country was actually established many years BC. Everybody wanted this piece of land, so we were always subjugated to some other country. And here is the flag, the coat of arms, a picture of the old city on a tiny hill. And perhaps, since you're unlikely to meet another Estonian because there aren't too many of us, maybe you'd like to hear what my language sounds like. Would you please recite in English, or if you know another language, John 3:16, while I take a drink, and then I will give it to you in my language. Please, would you start it? Now in Estonian. Sest nõnda Jumal on maailma armastanud, että oma ainutsyntinen pojan annut, että yksikään temassa usup ei saaks hukka, vai temalla oleks ikäväne elu. It's a very difficult language, but it was my first language, and I learned 4 of them before I was 10. So I had to grow up to find out that my first language was a difficult one. Well, wartime came. If you remember your history, that part of the world was disputed several times. Now use your imagination and think that here is a long conference table. On one end of the conference table sits one of the most evil persons on earth. His team is around him. On the table are maps. On this side sits a man who is equally evil and who has caused as much hurt. He has his team around him, and they're both looking at the maps. And one of them says to the other, okay, if you're going to take this part of Europe, I want that part. Have you guessed who they are? Hitler and Stalin. And no matter what your age or your level of study of history, everyone knows these names, unfortunately, because of all the hurt they caused. So first of all, Stalin got Estonia. It was a very perilous time. My father was a pastor of the church there as well as a conference president. The secret police called him in. They wanted him to spy for them. They even said, if you don't agree to do this, you're not going to leave this room alive. They let him go. Many years later, as I was compiling my own history, because obviously I was very tiny in those days, I asked my father, why do you think they didn't kill you like they did anybody who didn't cooperate? Why did they let you go? I still remember this good man, highly intelligent, highly accomplished, was looking out a window, and I actually thought he hadn't heard me. So I was almost ready to repeat the question when he turned around and he looked at me and he said, I don't know, because they never let anyone go once they had approached somebody, once the KGB had tapped you. He said, but I really think it's because God saw that I still had more work to do for him. And I believe that too. Well, I have very short time today and a long history, but I want to tell you one story about the Good Samaritan in my life. Unfortunately, one that I didn't meet. So sometimes the power of one individual even affects people in a way that they don't know that you did something good. The power of one individual to make a difference. Well, long history. The Germans came, the Nazis occupied Estonia, then the Soviets came back, and my father knew, and I proved him right many years later, that he had to escape. We had a very perilous journey. We were homeless. We had to leave everything behind. By that time, I was born. I don't remember much, except there are certain sounds and sights that still affect me. We sometimes never get over some of those things. Here is a train station that depicts the terrible journeys when the Soviet trucks would come on residential streets in the middle of the night, pull people out of their buildings. They couldn't pack anything. They couldn't say goodbye. They couldn't even take care of their pets. They would put them on cattle cars and ship them to Siberia. My parents told me how they would look out of the window and pray fervently, Lord, please save us. Finally, they had to leave. This is what it looked like. I had the good fortune when Estonia became free, when the Soviet Union broke up, to go back, find my relatives, and be able to work there a number of times with U.S. government money to be helpful. And I find some of these pictures interesting because you can see the tower there. Well, it was authentically rebuilt, and my office was across the street from that, and I used to practice a big organ in that very tower. The devastation was horrible, but the loss of human life was even worse. Here you can see a before and after picture. My parents were wise to leave, and this is the long route I experienced as a tiny child. I want to tell you about an incident that occurred toward the end of our journey. We had ended up in the northwest zone of Germany, which was under the British and Canadian rule. We were living with an Adventist farmer and his family, and when I work in that part of Germany, which I have several times, I have many memories. Even the air brings back some of those memories, even though I was a very small child. Well, what we didn't know was that in the middle of the night, the big four powers that had divided Germany after the war had decided to shift the borders, both for political and geographic reasons. We went to bed in the British zone, and the British armies and the Canadian armies were very kind. I have fond memories of them. In fact, my first love was a Canadian soldier, and he was good looking. Of course, I was 5 years old, but I had good taste. My father woke up one Sunday morning, and he started to go down to the little village, and he thought, my goodness, it's quiet. Well, there were no radios. They had been confiscated, no TV. So if you wanted the population to know anything, they put up posters on the walls, on the fences, on the trees. And so he saw one of those posters, and he went over. To his horror, the poster said, "This part of Germany now belongs to Soviet Russia. Anyone caught leaving their home will be shot on sight." He hurried back home. I still remember the feeling, the air of desperation. After all our escapes, as you can see on this route here, all our escapes, the bombings, homelessness, hunger, we were caught just when we thought everything was over. Finally, the farmer said, "We've got to do something. I know a little road that goes through the woods. I will take you there, and you can sneak across the border," because it was more dangerous for us, because if the communists came, they considered us deserters to be dealt with immediately or sent to Siberia. The German family, they weren't in quite the danger. So we started out in a little cart pulled by a cow. We were halfway there when suddenly the farmer turned back to us and said, "Look out, there are soldiers up ahead." We didn't know what kind of soldiers. Fortunately, they were the British soldiers. My father knew a little bit of English, so he got out of the little cart and tried to explain why it was so dangerous for us to be caught by the communists. The soldiers whispered one to the other, and then they looked at us and said, "All right, if you promise that you will never tell anyone that you've seen us, we'll let you go." Now think about it. That had to be the world's easiest promise to keep, because we were trying to sneak away. We got to the border. Hundreds of other people had thought of the same thing. No one was going anywhere. No one. The farmer left us. My father went up to one of the soldiers who was guarding the border, and fortunately they were still the British soldiers. He explained our situation, and the soldier, of course, said, "What can I do? But I tell you what, if you leave your family back here," I think it's the only time in my life I've been in insurance policy. "If you leave your family back here, I'll let you cross the border, and if you go about 2 miles, not far, and get the right permission and come back and show it to me, then I'll let all of you go." Now think of the risks. But again, my father said I had to do something. He ran. And ladies, imagine my mother, 2 tiny kids. At least she spoke the language, and the Adventists. Thank God for the Adventists, who had provided us with a family and a living while we had nothing. My father ran, and I think God worked a miracle, because he found the right official who listened, as again my father, in his limited English, blurted out the story. He took a little card and he wrote something on it. By now my father is in a panic. What's happening back at the border? Because no one knew when the Soviet armies were going to come. He ran back. He shows a note to the soldier, and they motion for us to come. Naturally, all the other people waiting, they started to murmur. We didn't ask. We crossed the border. We got away. 15 or so minutes later, there was a rumble of heavy army trucks. We quickly went into the woods. We had almost nothing with us, only one suitcase for the whole family. There were 3 and a half of us, because I was very small. But we just went and hid in the woods and looked. It was the Soviet armies. 15 minutes, my friends, and I wouldn't be here. I probably would be dead. God worked a miracle, but more importantly, God used one person to carry out that miracle. That man never knew what he did. My father was a wonderful man. He was a preacher, a teacher. He started the university in Bolivia. My brother worked for 22 years as a missionary in Africa, and I like to think that I've been able to do good. The power of one individual, and here is that note. It was a very simple note. It simply said, if you can do so without arousing too much curiosity from the others, you can let this man and his family through. Eventually, we were able to reach America. And then who would have thought that the Soviet Union, with all its power and might and control, would ever fall apart? But it did. So in 1992, I had the enormous privilege of going back. This is my home city where I was born. Going back, finding all my relatives, having the privilege of working in my own country to build up organizations that didn't want government money because for them it meant control. Helping organizations that could help others, all because of the power of one person. I'd like to close with this beautiful thought that an obscure Quaker, you know, that's the religion, came from the United Kingdom. It's the silent people. And this obscure Quaker wrote, I will only pass through this life again. If I can do any good, if I can show any kindness, let me do so now, because I may not pass this way again. I pray to God that what Jesus said at the end of his story will be something that we will take with us today. We don't always know what we can accomplish, but we should be ready to be the Good Samaritan for others. And as Jesus said, go and do likewise. May God bless you as you consider how you will go and do likewise.